My name's David Farrell. I think I've met most of you. I'm president of the Independent Institute. I'm delighted to invite you to our reception and presentation by our senior fellow, Robert Higgs, this evening. As you probably all know, we're in the midst of our college seminar called the Challenge of Liberty, which we hold each year. It's the second year we've held it here at Notre Dame de Namur University. We actually were going to have this reception in a smaller room, but we got moved yesterday. So if we had known, we would have invited a lot more people. So, but we're so glad that you're here. For those of you who are new to the Institute just passed our 25th anniversary. We were thrilled to have our gala. Some of you were at the gala last November. The Institute is a public policy research institute. It's an academic research organization, and we sponsor many books. We have about 140 fellows currently. We also produce a journal called the Independent Review, which is in its 17th year. Professor Higgs, we've been quite honored to be the editor of the journal. We are actually quite privileged to have it here at the university because the facilities are so appropriate size and convenience. And we have actually a great group of students from 10 countries this year. Next year, we're going to be actually adding a third seminar, which will be held in Colorado. And we'll be expanding over time based on the interest. Incidentally, for those of you who are interested in learning more about the seminar program, please check with us about that. And we also invite you to consider being a sponsor of scholarships for students, including like the ones from different countries who have joined with us this year. We're quite thrilled to also have a program that we would encourage you to participate in called Fund for the Future, which enables us to sponsor events like this, including the scholarships and many other projects. And I'm sure you all noticed we have many of our books, which I'm sure all the student participants this week have already had a chance to read. There'll be a test tomorrow. So I know it comes as a surprise, but it's okay. So in any event, it's a great night, and we have a wonderful opportunity to hear from our speaker tonight. Bob Higgs is an old friend. Bob is a seminal scholar. He got his PhD in economics from Johns Hopkins University. He's taught at numerous universities, including the University of Washington, Lafayette College, and elsewhere. He's been a senior fellow in political economy at the Independent Institute for quite a number of years. He's probably most famous for his book that came out just about 25 years ago called Crisis and Leviathan. The Institute is in the process of producing a 25th anniversary edition of it, which I think there'll be a lot of interest in. Bob is also known for many other works, including a book entitled Depression, War, and Cold War, which may come up tonight. His most recent book is called Delusions of Power, and many other works. And he blogs on our website, The Beacon, so he's on Facebook, so he's everywhere. So I'm delighted to introduce Bob Higgs.
Thank you, David. I'm sure my wife would dispute that I'm everywhere because I'm not at home right now and she has to take care of our chickens, ducks, and geese while I'm gone, but that's life, when you go on the road. I actually have a number of birds like that we raise. I live out in the country in southeast Louisiana, and so that's just my real life. And when I have a few minutes, I try to do some writing. And I want to talk to you tonight about the Great Depression and contrast and compare that Great Depression in the 1930s with the last several years that some people call the Great Recession. I've never been attracted to that particular title of the current troubles, but In any event, that's my topic tonight, and a lot of people started making this comparison fairly quickly back in 2008, 2009. Every time something seems to go seriously wrong in economic life, invariably somebody starts looking back at the Great Depression. That was it's called the Great Depression for good reason. It was the deepest, longest, most painful business bust of American history, and it had terrifically important consequences and legacies that we're still living with today, very many of them. So it's one of the great events, and in terms of economic history, arguably the greatest event of American history. And so many people think about it. There's still some people around who are old enough to remember living through it, although their numbers are dwindling fast these days. When I began to see these comparisons made, I was mostly brought up short by them, thinking, well, that's not right, that's not right, that's not right. So I've set out to give some talks, making my own comparisons, and to write a little bit in various places. And some of what I've written appears in my new book, Delusions of Power, along these lines. So what I want to do is to first of all make some general remarks about analytically the best way to think about business ups and downs in general, whether it's the current bust or any other. And then I want to walk through some of these comparisons of these two historic episodes. And if I have anybody left in the audience by that point, I'll maybe say a little bit about some of the legacies of the current events that we're still living through. It's very difficult to know what they're going to be because we're still in the midst of this episode. And we can look back on the Depression with more than 60 years of hindsight at this point. We may have to wait a long time to find out just what the full consequences of the current troubles will be, but I'm confident already that it's going to have some important and lasting consequences. And they're not good, I'm sorry to say. But let me say, first of all, that business ups and downs have been a feature of economic life in the United States for about 200 years. So there's nothing odd about them. The business busts, as a rule, were brief. In general, when business turned down in the 19th century and during the 20th century, usually a recovery occurred within a year or 2 years at most. So these were not deep depressions as a rule. They were relatively shallow, and recovery was fairly prompt. And that was the case throughout most of this long period, even though the government of the United States had no policy at all of reacting to these business downturns. There was no thought, no plan, no intention of mitigating them or turning the economy around or anything like that, really until the 1920s, when a number of economists and others began to fancy that they could actually use the government successfully as an instrument to moderate the business cycle and to smooth out the economy's growth over time. That was an example of what Hayek calls the pretense of knowledge. And I'm sorry to say that the economics profession today still has a similar pretense of knowledge. Most economists still believe today that the government can take certain actions that will have the effect of smoothing the business cycle and making economic growth follow a more regular path. I think this is still a pretense of knowledge, and I think, in fact, that the government officials who carry out these policies don't know what they're doing, and when they carry them out, they make matters worse. And in fact, my thumbnail hypothesis about the Great Depression is that It was the perfect storm of bad government policies that took what would have probably been another minor recession with a fairly prompt recovery and made it a great, long, deep, painful disaster whose effects we're still suffering today. So why are people so mixed up about the business cycle? First of all, what we call macroeconomics, the economics of economic aggregates, the entire economy's output, the price level for everything being produced in the economy, the level of employment or unemployment in the whole economy. This kind of economics that everybody knows about now. It's mentioned in news reports about economic affairs all the time. And if you ever took an economics course in college, you probably encountered this kind of analysis. This was developed mainly beginning in the 1930s, and its real impetus was the landmark book by John Maynard Keynes, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, published in 1936. And Keynes had a great effect. He's considered by almost everybody as one of the most important economists of the past century, and I would agree with that, although I think the way in which he's been important is not one that makes me envy him. But nonetheless, he had a great influence on economists. Thinking about economic life in this way, I believe, is a fundamental mistake. Thinking about aggregates is almost always a way to misunderstand what's going on and why things are happening as they are. It conceals the entire structure of the economy, the parts that make up the economy, the thousands upon thousands of different markets for different kinds of products and services. The analysis of that kind of structured economic order had been undertaken by economists for a long time. It goes way back in a systematic way to the 18th century, and you can find much earlier analyses going back even to the 15th century. But certainly in the 18th century, in the work of people like Adam Smith and the Frenchman Turgot, we see very sophisticated attempts to understand the operation of the economy in terms of its structure, okay? How markets interact, what generates economic growth or increasing wealth for a whole economy, and so forth. And economists developed that way of thinking for a long time, from Turgot and Smith on up into the 20th century. And they, in a way, they still do that, but unfortunately, to do that, and only that, was shoved aside by the embrace of macroeconomics as part of this so-called Keynesian revolution. So these aggregates tend to mislead us. They conceal the fact that the economy can become distorted. The structure can be twisted in ways that are not sustainable, particularly by government policies and monetary policies especially. And the only effective way to repair those distortions is to repair them, not to pretend they're not there or to act as if they don't exist or are not important. Okay? If you have a housing boom because of certain government policies and then you have a housing bust, as you must eventually if you've been given artificial signals to create that housing boom in the first place, then the idea that you want to just keep stimulating house building to get rid of the unemployed house building workers is stupid. You need to reallocate at least some of those people to other lines of economic activity. And if you don't do that, you're going to just have the same problem persisting. But if you think of the economy as an aggregate, you don't see the difference between employing another carpenter in Miami Beach and employing another miner in Idaho. It's just another worker in the labor force, and the whole economy has this one aggregate labor force. And From it, you measure a certain employment rate and an unemployment rate. This is very bad economics. You're constantly led to make new mistakes on top of old ones if you follow this kind of thinking. So market restructuring historically was what repaired these busts that took place. Right? For various reasons, and even in the 19th century, government interventions were sufficient to create distortions in economic life. And so sometimes there would be artificial booms, followed inevitably by busts. But because the government didn't intervene to systematically offset those busts, the market did it. Okay? Some firms that had made mistakes went bankrupt. Okay? The workers they had hired went elsewhere and got jobs in firms that were still viable, that were still serving consumers in ways that allowed them to earn an acceptable rate of return on their investments. So the market restructures itself automatically. You don't have to have a plan. In fact, if you have a plan, you've already ensured that it's not going to work. Okay? That's the worst thing you can have in politics is a plan. But ever since the 1930s, people have been enamored with the plan. And the planners are still among us. When we intervene further in a recession or a depression, we distort the price signals and the profit signals that are doing the work of telling people what they need to do now. Okay? People that should be shutting up shop, people that should be looking for a different kind of work, don't get it because they're not necessarily losing money if they're propped up or bailed out by some government plan. If workers are somehow kept on the job, or if they're somehow supported in unemployment by long periods of unemployment benefits paid to them, which are invariably nowadays extended as the recession extends, they don't look for new jobs very energetically. So we continue to have a lot of workers who aren't doing the work that would be valuable for them to do. So government intervention blocks and distorts the operation of the price system, and it makes matters worse, and we get slow recoveries and unsustainable further interventions. That's what we have going on right now. We've had it going on from the time this recession began in 2008. It's still going on today because the kinds of elementary propositions I've just recited are not accepted by the economics profession, the political profession, the media people who write about these things. And it's extremely unfortunate that they're not accepted. The worst case we can have is that there's a call for government to do something, and there always is now, that call, and that it does something counterproductive. And if it does something, it's almost certain that it will be counterproductive. And that the intervention is large scale, so that if the government just wanted to waste, $1 billion, that would be one thing. We could assimilate that. But if they want to waste $1 trillion, that may create big troubles for us. And recently, they have indeed wasted a good deal more than $1 trillion in anti-recession measures of one kind or another. So this is kind of the overarching points I'd like you to bear in mind as I walk through the comparisons between the Great Depression and the current troubles. In both cases, easy money policies preceded the bust. The Fed trying to help the British return to the gold standard at the pre-war par for the pound sterling, led the New York Federal Reserve Bank to cooperate with the Bank of England in adopting easy money policies in the United States so that money wouldn't flee England for investment in the United States. And the upshot of that was not just that it helped the British, but that it gave a false signal to a lot of investors in the United States, because the lowered interest rates this policy produced made a lot of long-term projects such as real estate developments look profitable when they really weren't. They weren't going to play out successfully in the long run, but they looked as if they would because the interest rate was so low in the mid-1920s. So here in this country, we had a huge construction boom of residential housing, of office buildings, to a lesser extent of factory buildings and other infrastructure. And much of this building was malinvestment in terms of the language of Austrian economics. It was investment that was bound to be unsuccessful in the long term. And so, you know, it did eventually lead to the bust of 1929 and the following years. Likewise, we had easy money policy in this country again because of the Fed's monetary policy, especially 2002 to 2005, when it pushed short-term interest rates so low for the banks that they were virtually zero in real terms. So banks had unlimited funding that cost them nothing. And, you know, there's so much money floating around for them to lend, they would be willing to lend to almost anybody who had a pulse. So that's what they did. And much of this money got channeled into housing or housing-related investments, where prices seemed to be going up and people began to dream that they would never go anywhere else but up. And on the basis of that very stupid assumption, they built up a whole array of financial securities, derivatives of various kinds, which you could all track back to a value based on the repayment of interest on mortgage loans by people who could not afford those loans and were bound to go belly up sooner or later in paying what they had promised to repay to the lenders. And eventually, of course, when that started to happen after 2006, a lot of these new instruments began to lose value and people began to panic and flail around. And then finally, by the fall of 2008, the whole house of cards fell apart, and the biggest financial institutions in the country were yelping for bailouts and getting them. And this can be tracked back to easy money policies in the earlier part of that decade, when it was just mistaken. You know, it was the Maestro, as they call Greenspan. The Maestro was a faker. You know, he was the man behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz. He was no maestro. He just thought he knew what he was doing, and he was clueless. And he, of course, was smarter than most of these guys. So these are common elements. Real estate is usually found in the mix when we have these kinds of mistakes going on, because it's one of the long-term investments that is typically happening to some extent in any economy. It's nothing bad about a real estate development per se. It's just that there are some that can be profitable and some that can look profitable only if the interest rate is distorted downward. So we had a housing boom and a building boom in commercial properties to some extent, particularly from 2002 to 2006. And it was an artificial boom. It was based on a false signal created by monetary policy. And we had all these financial gimmicks. Whenever you have this kind of situation with easy money and a lot of malinvestments, it always attracts financial geniuses to dream up new financial instruments and organizations and forms of transacting and what have you. And these are just a couple of them. All the mortgage-related securities and the credit default swaps, which were put in place because they weren't regulated by insurance regulators, but they were a form of insurance. As it turned out, not a very good form in the circumstances, but that's another story. But you can see just beautiful parallels in the lead up to both of these situations. Now, we come to, inevitably, the bust. When government sends out false signals, it distorts the structure in a way that can't be sustained, so it breaks apart. And when it starts breaking apart, firms start going bankrupt, start laying off workers. You know, there's a kind of snowballing downward naturally. Some good firms get dragged down in the process, along with the malinvestments. So, and Great Depression, we had the panic from the stock market crash in October, and a lot of people have forgotten that after that, the stock market only crashed for a couple of months in 1929, and it stopped falling. And it came back. It came back a lot. Not back to where it had been, but it came back a lot. And so, there were lots of people, and from the President of the United States on down, were telling the public, everything is sound, everything is good here, don't panic, buy some stocks. Irving Fisher, the smartest economist America ever produced, I was told by colleagues at the University of Washington. Irving Fisher was a great economist, but Irving Fisher was a little mixed up too. And he had the courage of his convictions. Fisher was not just an economist, he was actually a guy who passed what my friend Deirdre McCluskey calls the Great American Test. If you're so smart, why aren't you rich? Okay? Well, Irving Fisher was so smart that he actually got rich for a while. He eventually even lost the house he lived in. It was a very sad story. But he lost all his money in the crash because he really believed what he was teaching. He believed that the stock market would rebound, the economy was not going to fall very much, and so forth. And a lot of other people believed that too. So there was this rally into the spring of 1930 in the stock market, now known as the suckers rally, because from the spring onward, the stock market turned down again. And by the time it hit bottom late in 1932, it lost about 80 to 85% of its value as of 1929. So, the stock market was almost completely wiped out in that case. And the current crisis, in the winter of 2007-8, we peaked out on real activity, and then we puttered along for a while until the debacle of September 2008, when a lot of these financial markets panicked, and everybody else was panicking too. We had kind of a rally. I don't know if I should call it a suckers rally or not. It's too early to tell. I'm sure some of you have followed this, maybe even put money into it. I myself held back from buying any stocks since I unloaded most of the ones I had at the beginning of 2008. So I'm no Irving Fisher, I can tell you that. He was much smarter than I am. The output only fell about 5%. And that's one reason I don't like to refer to the Great Recession. Okay, that's a serious recession. But, to think it's comparable to the Great Depression is just not even in the right ballpark. When real output fell by 30% from mid-1929 to the spring of 1933. So, 5% is not good, but it's a lot different from 30%. This is a kind of profile I made up. It's very helpful sometimes to see how things went. This solid line here in the chart is the real gross domestic product. And you see there the great decline, which I told you is 30%. You can't see that from this chart because it's in logarithms. But 30% fall. Then there's recovery, and a fall again in 1938 before the economy's fully recovered, and then a rise again through this strange period where it looks as if the government is producing more than it can produce during the war. People call that the miracle of production during World War II. It's actually an accounting artifact of the way defense goods and services were priced. They're not priced on ordinary markets, so they were priced by negotiations between government buyers, spending other people's money, and sellers who were eager to get as much as they could for a bomber or a tank or warship or whatever it was they had to sell. Okay? So it looks as if we we produced a lot of stuff, and indeed we did produce a lot of stuff in some kind of physical sense. 300,000 airplanes, 18 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. The magnitudes are unbelievable. 6,000 warships. You could never do anything like these numbers today. It takes the Pentagon 50 years to produce a new fighter plane now. But they were in a hurry in 1942 through 45. So they did, in a way, do miraculous things. But that doesn't tell us anything about what it was worth. GDP purports to be a measure of the value of the economy's total output. And the truth is, although I don't have time to really dwell on this, that there's no way to value this kind of government-purchased output. It just isn't. You can pretend that it's a market you're buying it on, but it isn't. There's only one buyer. It's the government spending other people's money, so it's not weighing purchases in the same way you and I do. And there was often just one seller, for that matter. Some of these munitions were highly specialized, or not more than one or two or three farms had converted to produce a certain war good or service. So this was not a real market, and so we don't know what this stuff was worth. Presumably at some value. We do know that a lot of the capital the government built during the war, built a lot of factories and shipyards and airfields, and you name it. Long list of investments were made, and it looked at the time as if, in fact, the government had sort of done what Keynes recommends near the end of his book, The General Theory, which is it had socialized investment, because the amount being spent during the war by the government for investment projects was just industrial projects was twice the amount being spent by private investors. But even the private investors were only spending it on projects the government would approve, because if it didn't have government approval, the government would not allocate raw materials for them to carry out the project. And during the war, the government controlled all the steel, all the copper, all the aluminum by physical allocations. So even what looks like private activity during the war is very deceptive, very difficult to accept in its measurements. A large element of arbitrariness is embedded in it. So during the Depression here, you see that these bars, which measure just the private part of GDP, sort of follow the same profile as overall GDP. But during the war, it doesn't follow at all. Because after 1941, when real GDP seems to shoot up, it was growing almost 20% a year for 3 years in a row. The economy's never grown that fast, can't grow that fast, okay? Normally. And private output actually fell. It was lower all throughout the war than it had been in 1941, when we were just starting to gear up for the war. And then, of course, when the government terminated these war contracts, when the war ended late 1945 and into 1946, and sent all these soldiers home, or almost all of them, 10 million of them in 1 year, you see what happened to private output. It shot up at what appears to be, in the official data, a 30% increase in one single year. And I actually think that's an understatement for various reasons, the amount that it actually shot up. But it was, by the way, a decisive refutation of everything you've been taught in college about Keynesian economics. Because if the government reduces its spending, as it did in this case, enormously in 1 year, every species of Keynesian theory tells you you're going to create a massive fall in private output. That's the multiplier effect, okay? But instead, not only was it not a massive fall in private output, it was as far in the opposite direction as you could possibly go. It was an enormous, unprecedented, unequaled increase in private output. Yeah. Mainstream economists are always crowing about how scientific they are. Their economics makes predictions. And they test their hypotheses against the facts. Bull. Okay? If they did that, they would have seen this was the most decisive experiment in all of our economic history. And it refuted the same theories they've been teaching ever since. Didn't stop them. Did not stop them. This is what happened recently. The period of decline in real GDP was from the second quarter of 2008 to the first into the early part of 2009. Then started to recover, and as you can see in the latest data, which take us through the second quarter of this year, very preliminary estimates, these will probably be revised substantially before long. But at all events, we're now well above the level of real GDP that the economy had achieved before the recent bust. So stop there or there. Here's our unemployment rate in the recent experience. You can see it got pretty low. It got pretty close to 4% by the early part of 2007. It began to creep up a little bit, but then it shot up in late 2008, and for quite a while was close to 10%, and has slowly fallen back to something between 8 and 9% pretty steadily for the last couple of years. So this is where the economy seems to be stuck. This is not a good report. This is not a good situation, particularly when you notice that at the same time the unemployment rate has risen so substantially. It's about twice what it was before the bust. It doesn't look as if it's going to fall much in the future as far as all the forecasts are concerned. A great many people have actually left the labor force, so they're not even counted in this measure of the unemployment rate here. They're just non-persons, non-workers now. Millions of people have gone onto the disability insurance program in the last 4 years because it was possible for them to get income that way. And in many cases, the older people didn't see much prospect of getting a job, at least not a job they would take. So they've just gone in and told the examiner their back hurts them terribly all the time. See, there are certain complaints that no one can really deny because there are no tests or anything. So people find out what kind of complaints to make, and they make them. So we've now got a gigantic number of people receiving disability benefits. It's far more than we're receiving this kind of benefit in the days when many more people did physically demanding jobs and really did hurt their backs and other parts of their bodies. But now with most people, working by sitting on their rear ends all day in front of a computer, we've got these millions and millions of disabled people, as it were. But this is just another way the dole is operated to keep money flowing to people who cannot land a private job. Here we see weekly hours worked, another way of seeing how sick the economy is. It fell about 8% or so, and or more than that at one point in 2010. It was down about 12 or 13%. It's come back a little bit, but now it's down about five percentage points in terms of private weekly hours worked. Now, the reason this is important is that these are the people that produce things that consumers really value. Private workers. The water is muddied sometimes when you look at overall employment because it includes all the government employees. And indeed, even some of these people are indirectly living off government grants and contracts and purchases and so forth. It's still counted as private workers. But nonetheless, the fact is, we've been stuck down there for years on end now with no kind of trend movement evident about recovering or getting back to where we were. Okay, well, how did we get into these situations? In the case of the Great Depression, we had an activist President Hoover, the one they called the do-nothing president. Hoover did more than any president had ever done before him to take counter-recessionary actions. And unfortunately, all the things he did of any consequence made the contraction worse. He got employers to hold up wages when wages should have been falling in the circumstances. That made unemployment greater than it otherwise would have been. He signed a huge increase in tariffs, suppressing the International Division of Labor, specialization from which all nations benefited. He signed the creation of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was a huge bailout agency for badly managed banks, insurance companies, and railroads. The recent bailouts, a lot of people don't realize, are nothing new. And in fact, the RFC did a lot of this identical things. People got pretty excited when it turned out that the TARP program was changed before ever being implemented and changed into a government program to just invest in banks. The government just went out and bought preferred shares in hundreds of banks. Well, for the historian, he says, oh yeah, that's what the RFC did. Not for quite as many banks, but for a lot of them after 1932. So that's, been there, done that. There's not a whole lot in economic history that you haven't seen before in some form. So we had bailouts under Hoover. We had distortion of the wage structure. We had taxes increased hugely, not only through tariffs, but income tax rates were raised. 1932 by a greater amount than any previous law had raised tax rates. And at the same time, the Federal Reserve System had decided that although it was viewed as the lender of last resort, it didn't want to lend. So it kind of stood there and watched the whole thing while almost 10,000 banks failed. And not all economists, but practically all economists agree that that was a mistake, that it could have taken action to prevent some of the sound banks from failing, but they were dragged down by the failing ones. And most of those failed banks, by the way, were small, very small, rural banks serving farmers, and all these bank failures reflect more than anything else the fact that we have a unit banking system in the United States. State banking laws didn't allow banking across state lines. And in many cases, they didn't allow any branch banking whatsoever. So we had these tiny little banking offices, or sometimes big banks, but that was it. The bank didn't have any branches, any other offices, so it tended to be very dependent on circumstances of local borrowers. Well, if you had a local disaster of some kind, like the wheat market falls by 50%, which it did, and your little bank is in the middle of Montana, well, you're cooked. That's it, These guys aren't going to be able to repay their loans, and you're going to have to close your doors and pay out, what you can in bankruptcy. And all over the country, we had banks in this situation in the early 1930s. If you look at Canada, Canada had a very similar depression during the 1930s, and about an equal drop in real GDP. Canada had very similar economic structure in a lot of ways, a little more agricultural than the U.S. at that time. How many banks failed in Canada? None. Zero. Not a one. Now think of that. That's telling us an enormous story. Why don't more people recognize this when they start talking about why these banks are failing? Right? In Canada, you didn't have these restrictions on branching, and you had only like 7 or 8 banks in the whole country. They were large. They operated all over the country. So, you know, when the wheat price fell 50%, that was bad on, you know, Manitoba and Saskatchewan, to be sure. But the bank that had lent to those farmers out there didn't have all its loans there. It had some in Ontario and some in Quebec. So it survived. It was diversified. Diversification is a beautiful thing. And that's what we didn't have in American banking. So that was a big part of the banking collapse of the early 30s. Then we got FDR, and you know, if Hoover had been Mr. Activist, like FDR was Mr. Activist on steroids, you know, because by that time, practically everybody in the country is desperate for a savior.